Have you ever heard someone confess to a crime that technically never happened? What would you do if you were locked in a cell and on the third night, a voice started talking to you from a place no one should be? This is not just another prison story. It's a real case shrouded in silence, unexplained disappearances, and a prison confession that to this day challenges the American penal system. Thomas Riggs was booked, arrested, and that same week, disappeared. The cell where he slept was still locked from the inside. No signs of leakage, no witnesses. The other prisoner, Elijah Crowe, spent 11 years without uttering a word, until that morning. What did he say? He even made the prison guards ask for a transfer. You're about to enter one of the most mysterious cases ever recorded inside a federal prison, where cameras failed, files disappeared, and names began to appear in places that shouldn't even exist. Watch this video until the end, and you will get goosebumps. What you are about to discover may surprise you, because what you are about to hear may not have even been said by anyone alive. And that's exactly when it all started to make sense. His name was Elijah Crowe, but among the guards and inmates, he was known by another name, what you listen to. He was 39 years old, completed inside the maximum security penitentiary in Florence, Colorado, where the worst criminals in the United States were held. The record was lean: kidnapping, coercion, threat. No. Homicide charges confirmed, but the records showed something even more disturbing. Everyone who crossed paths with him disappeared, literally, and he never denied it. I just watched. Elijah was not aggressive. He didn't scream. I didn't argue. He was methodical to the point of causing discomfort. He always ate at the same pace, the same amount, at the same time. I took a shower at 3:17 in the morning. I prayed for something that no one could identify. He slept, standing up, leaning against the wall, his eyes fixed on a point on the ceiling as if he were waiting for an answer. He never spoke to psychologists. He never responded to the pastors. But I wrote it down. Entire pages of symbols, separate sentences, drawings of corridors that didn't exist in the prison. His cell was the coldest in the ward, and even without permission, it never collected dust. Nobody understood how. He didn't touch anyone, but everyone avoided him. There was a kind of informal code among the agents. Elijah should not have cellmates. But in March of that year, something changed. He asked to share the space. The justification was whispered to the night agent. He talks in his sleep. I want to hear it. That sentence was enough to free the cell. Thomas Riggs entered 3 days later, young, inexperienced, and with too little background to warrant an isolation cell. But the truth is, Elijah didn't want a cellmate. He wanted a return channel, someone who completed the cycle. Because, as he would say, quietly when he thought no one was listening, some presences are not born, they are evoked. And in that cell, no one knew for sure who the prisoner was, or the visitor. Thomas Riggs was 26 years old. His criminal record was clean until the last 6 months. The charge that led to his arrest seemed trivial, assaulting a police officer during a street fight. But the report was contradictory. The medical report did not match the police report, and the security camera recording that supposedly proved the crime was never attached to the case. Even so, he was convicted in record time and transferred to a maximum security prison, which caused surprise among public lawyers. No one understood why, but Elijah understood. The young man was placed in cell 3B, one of the most isolated in the East Wing, where Elijah Crowe had already lived for years. The request came from Elijah, a detainee with no speech history, no contacts, no privileges, who nevertheless had his request granted. The choice was not random. It was premeditated. Thomas talked in his sleep. It was a detail that went unnoticed during medical examinations, but Elijah knew, and that detail was enough. In the early hours of the morning, meaningless phrases escaped Thomas's lips. Codes, dates, passages in vulgar Latin, crossed out names. Elijah listened, recorded, murmured back. The cell became colder during these hours, and Thomas started waking up with superficial cuts on his arms. with no memory of how or why. But there were no screams, no calls for help, just silence. Thomas was an orphan, no family, no visitors, no one to report anything outside. Elijah studied it for months before making the request. Every absence in the boy's life was a permission. Every weakness, an open door. He didn't look for victims with resistance. I looked for gaps. Thomas wasn't just ideal. He was needed. Because according to Elijah, certain words can only be said by mouths that never ask to speak. And Thomas spoke. Even sleeping. Even when it was no longer there. Cell 3B was no ordinary cell. Although officially listed as identical to the others, the space presented variations that went unnoticed for years. Extra millimeters in the gap in the side wall, a blind spot in the cameras, and a failure in thermal insulation that made the space up to 5 degrees colder than the rest of the block. For most, insignificant details. For Elijah Crowe, architectural perfection. He never asked for personal belongings, but he kept a piece of cloth under his mattress, a habit the guards attributed to paranoia. It was actually a marker. Every night, he would move it a few inches, creating a sort of rudimentary compass that oriented him to the position of the sounds he heard in the walls. Around his bed, he would use the metal of the window grate to scratch patterns on the floor, circular, nearly invisible symbols, erased by daily cleaning and redrawn with surgical precision. For 3 weeks before Thomas arrived, Elijah changed the interior environment without anyone noticing. He used the steam from the baths to create cracks in the corners. He soaked part of the mattress to cause water to leak into one of the corners. With the flush of the pipe, he scratched an old name, Caleb, behind the sink mirror. A name that did not appear in any prison records, but that appeared in forgotten documents from 1979, about an inmate who disappeared without a trace. Elijah drew the same hallways over and over on pieces of toilet paper, not the corridors of the current penitentiary, but of a block that had been disused since the 80s. They always ended at the same point, a cell with the doorknob inverted, facing inwards. On the quietest nights, he murmured meaningless phrases. You only hear what you have already answered. Doors don't open, they return. It was all part of the preparation. Every detail, every mark, every degree of temperature less. Elijah wasn't expecting Thomas. He was shaping the cell, so that it could cross, and when Thomas walked in, the ritual was ready. The first night Thomas tried to talk. Elijah just watched, his eyes narrowed, as if measuring the density of sound in the air. He didn't answer. He didn't move. When the light went out, he lay awake until the generator's last second of operation. At 3:03, when everything went quiet, he whispered something, not to Thomas, but to the emptiness in the far corner of the cell. On the second night, Thomas began to talk in his sleep. His voice was different, deeper, more slow. He said disjointed words, dates he had never experienced, names he did not know. When he woke up, he could not remember anything. But Elijah remembered. He wrote down each sentence using the dust on the walls and the tip of a chipped fingernail on the concrete wall. It was that night that Elijah broke the silence. Not to talk, but to measure. You answered, she said, without looking at him. Thomas hesitated. He asked, what did I answer? Elijah laughed for the first time, and he added, on the third he gives it back to you. During the day, Thomas began to notice changes. Small cuts appearing on the forearm, words drawn on mirror condensation, a constant hum in the plumbing, always at the same time, 3:16 a.m. On the third night, Thomas woke up with tears in his eyes. He said he dreamed of a dark corridor and a man standing at the end, without a face. Elijah stood up for the first time in days and whispered behind him, he's not new here, he just had nowhere to go back. Thomas started sleeping less. He moved away from the mattress, he rolled up the blankets like barriers, but the whisper came back, always at 03:16, and that morning he answered, a single word said without meaning to, try. The sound that followed was dry, like wood breaking from the inside out. The lights flickered. The buzzing stopped. Elijah, standing in the center of the cell, simply said, Now he will talk to you. And then Thomas understood. Elijah never wanted to talk. He just needed someone to say yes. At 3:16 a.m. on the third night, the cell experienced a simultaneous power failure to the cameras and motion sensors. Duration, exactly 47 seconds. Long enough to erase the evidence, or invoke what needed to happen. Thomas woke up sitting up, his back pressed against the wall, his eyes wide. He didn't scream. It didn't move. He just stared at the corner where, on other nights, he heard the whispers. But that morning, there was more than sound. There was form. Elijah was not asleep. He was kneeling, his hands flat on the floor, muttering phrases in a repetitive cadence, like a chant. Words in sequence, as if reciting something he had learned long ago. Thomas tried to scream, but there was no voice. His lungs felt empty. In the corner of the cell, damp began to form on the floor, but it wasn't a leak. It was as if the concrete was sweating. It dripped dark, dense, slow. The temperature dropped 5 degrees, and from the mirror, which never reflected completely, a shadow fell away. She had no face. It had no defined members, but it had direction. Thomas tried to get up, but he was paralyzed. His body didn't react, as if anesthetized from the inside. The liquid from the floor rose up the sides of the mattress, infiltrating it. Elijah still had his eyes closed, but he was smiling. There was no noise, no blood, no struggle. Just the sound of something dragging along the inside of the wall, like wood was being split from the inside. And then, silence. At 3:17 a.m., the systems came back on. The light came on. Elijah was alone, sitting on the floor, clean, still. Thomas was gone. No sign of a struggle, no disturbance in the sheets, just the mattress, slightly sunken and damp. In the middle of the floor, under the beam of light, a sentence appeared written in dark liquid, impossible to identify. The body was returned to the previous state, and Elijah, without looking at the camera that had started, working again, murmured, "Now he can listen to what got stuck." Thomas didn't die. He was removed, exactly like the others. When the guards opened the cell at 6 a.m., security protocol was followed to the letter. No sudden movements, no direct contact. Elijah's cell was known for a history of unexplained events, although never officially documented. They expected an outburst, a body, screams, but they found only silence. Elijah was on his back, curled up in a fetal position on the mattress, his eyes open and staring into space. No sign of Thomas Riggs, no sign of an escape, no structural changes to the cell, but something didn't make sense. The mattress where Thomas had slept was slightly sunken, still warm to the touch, as if someone had gotten up just a few minutes ago. On the side wall, under the plaster of the window, a sequence of numbers scratched with a fingernail, 03160447. No apparent meaning, no official explanation. The motion sensors didn't detect anything. The video system did not record. The cameras, according to the technical report, turned off due to a synchronized internal failure, an error so rare that it had only occurred twice in the penitentiary's history. In the previous 2, inmates had also disappeared. Elijah was questioned that same morning, but he did not resist, nor did he provoke. He simply answered in an almost childish voice, "He was listened to. Now he no longer belongs." On the mattress, under the pillowcase, a laminated newspaper. Clipping was found folded 4 times. It was from 1982. It reported the disappearance of Caleb O. Mason, 27, arrested for identity theft. The cell? The same. The position of the body in the drawing of the report? Identical to the mark left on Thomas's mattress. The blood they identified in the corner of the wall was not human, but it had active hemoglobin, as if it had been collected moments before, and the phrase written on the floor, "previously present," was gone. Not erased. Gone. As if it had never existed. The cell was sealed. But Elijah remained there, and every night at 3:16 a.m. he murmured the same phrase with his eyes closed, "Only 5 more to go." There was no burial. There was no body, not even a skeleton. Thomas Riggs disappeared without leaving a biological, digital, or visual trace. No sign of a struggle, no cry for help, no recorded image. His cell remained sealed, as if his absence was part of the structure. But there was something left on purpose, something that could not be ignored. Inside the sink pipes, hidden under a weather-corroded iron cover, was a piece of fabric wrapped in old plastic. When they opened it, investigators saw a faded photo. Thomas, from behind, walking down a hallway that did not belong in this penitentiary. The date on the edge 3/10, 1982. On the back of the image, a sentence written with an almost erased blue pen. "They come back for what we forgot to save." The image was considered a fraud, but no expert was able to identify the type of paper, nor the origin of the ink. Elijah did not comment. When asked about the photo, he looked up at the ceiling and whispered, he left this because he wanted to be remembered, but not found. The next morning, cell 3B was inspected again. In the corner where the mattress touched the wall, there was a cavity. It was not visible to the naked eye, but using thermal sensors, they identified a hollow compartment. Inside were 7 carefully packed objects. A child's hospital. Identification bracelet with the name Caleb O. Mason, a broken crucifix, a 1979 boarding pass for O'Hare, Chicago, a page of diary with the name Evelyn circled, 3 human teeth. All names associated with the objects belonged to people missing within the penitentiary system. None of them were ever officially listed as deceased, all with a single point in common. They passed through cell 3B between 1978 and 1991. The cell had been inactive for 2 decades until it was reactivated for Elijah. An administrative error, they said. But Elijah, when asked if he knew about this, simply replied, "It wasn't a mistake, it was continuity." Thomas Riggs didn't run away. He wasn't killed. It was added, at a countdown that no one knows who started it. It was guard Ray Lasker who understood first. Veteran, 22 years in prison, convinced skeptic. For him, everything had a logical explanation, until that night. During the routine inspection, he noticed something strange in the inmates. Digital records. Thomas Riggs appeared with an active record but no photo, no fingerprints, no license plate. It was as if the name existed, but the man had never entered. Lasker decided to investigate on his own. He accessed the physical files, old files, and found Thomas's intake form. Stamped, signed, everything in order. But the signature of the responsible agent was from someone who had been away on medical leave for months. Restless, he reviewed the security footage from the days before. Thomas arrived. No footage showed him being escorted, no images of him in the common areas, the cafeterias, not even at the medical triage. Just cell 3B with Elijah, and another silhouette in the background, blurry, distorted. Lasker took the tape for analysis, but the video became corrupted upon extraction. One of the IT analysts said the compression code was repeated in layers, as if the same frame had been recorded over you multiple times, a flaw considered technically impossible. It was then that Lasker made his mistake. He returned to cell 3B alone after hours, under the pretext of figuring out what had happened. When he opened the door, Elijah was sitting in the opposite corner, motionless, staring at something in the dark. Lasker asked, "Where's Thomas?" Elijah replied without moving his eyes. "It's still here, just no longer on the side you call the present." On the floor of the cell, there was a circular mark scratched with millimeter precision. Inside, a small phrase carved with the bedpost. "You saw it. Now you listen." That night, Lasker requested a transfer. He never spoke about it again. But a detail was reported by another agent days later. Every dawn since then, Lasker woke up at 3:16 a.m., and he said he heard someone calling for him from inside the wall. Elijah Crowe never showed emotional change, not during interrogations, not during psychiatric examinations, not even when the surrounding cells were emptied on orders from above. It was as if everything was happening according to a plan drawn up decades before. After Thomas disappeared and the hidden objects were discovered, Elijah was watched 24 hours a day by 3 different cameras. He didn't complain. He didn't change his routine. He continued to wake up at 3:16 a.m. He continued to mumble phrases that didn't belong to any language. In the security wing, the noises began to intensify. Sounds picked up only by ambient microphones, spaced knocks, dry cracks, whispers amplified by the metallic reverberation of the bars. Technicians even suggested electromagnetic interference, but they did not explain why they only occurred when Elijah opened his eyes. During an internal inspection, the security supervisor asked that Elijah be questioned again, this time with forensic psychologists present. His response was simple: "You came to listen, but you don't know how to keep quiet." In the session report, a disturbing observation: all electronic devices present, recorders, cameras, microphones, failed simultaneously at minute 47 of the conversation. When they returned, the files were blank, but the backup analog tapes stored on another floor picked up a noise, a deep, drawn-out breath that filled the 47 seconds of blackout. Elijah, when confronted, simply said, "It was just a rehearsal. He likes to repeat it until someone understands." In the following days, he began to write more frequently. He used his own blood when the pencil was removed. He didn't write sentences. He drew spirals, arrows, lines that formed labyrinths. They all led to the same center, a cell with the number 3B inverted, as if seen inside out. Even surrounded, observed, documented, Elijah seemed more in control than ever. Psychologists classified him as potentially catalyzing dissociative states in third parties. But he had already defined his role there. Elijah was not the perpetrator of the crime. He was just the narrator. And as he himself said, only says what the other. Side blows. It was on the 11th day after Thomas's disappearance that Elijah finally spoke, not to the agents, not to the psychologists, but to the empty cell in front of him. He woke at 3:16 a.m., as usual. But this time, he didn't whisper. He spoke clearly, slowly, as if he were reading from a text he had memorized long ago. The environmental camera recording captured every word. The official transcript was classified, but an excerpt was leaked among prison officials themselves. "The body doesn't need to die, it just needs to forget it's here. That's what it did, that's why it disappeared," Elijah continued. "The cell is a box, the name is the key." He said the right name. He accepted it. It was enough. The silence after the speech was absolute. The guards, even though they were used to the unpredictable, were hesitant to intervene. One of them, who was watching the monitor in the security room, reported feeling an extreme chill, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. But the thermometers registered the opposite, 43 degrees. The next morning, Elijah was moved to a padded room. Not for physical safety, but by administrative order. The authorities wanted to isolate any potential source of influence. But Elijah did not protest. He simply left a new pattern of marks on the mattress, 3 overlapping circles with an arrow pointing inward. When asked why he had confessed, Elijah replied without hesitation, "I confessed what needed to be said. The rest, he's still going to say." Psychiatrists tried to interpret it as a dissociative delirium, but the system recording picked up something no one expected. Seconds before Elijah spoke, another voice appeared, deeper, more slurred, saying, "Now you speak." That voice didn't belong to any inmate, no guard, no person present. It was analyzed, tested, isolated, and it still has no confirmed origin. Elijah's confession did not clarify the case. She expanded it, as if to say, that was just the first chapter. Thomas Riggs' disappearance, the marks on the cell, Elijah's partial confession, they all seemed to revolve around the same narrative. But it was an illusion. What seemed like an isolated crime was, in fact, the repetition of a cycle, a hidden structure that has existed for decades beneath the prison system. And Elijah wasn't the protagonist. It was the messenger. Forensic analyses revealed something even more disturbing. The objects hidden in the wall of cell 3B corresponded to inmates who, in different decades, disappeared in federal prisons with identical patterns. No cameras, no fingerprints, no explanation. Only the time in common. Everyone disappeared at 3:16 a.m., and everyone, without exception, had passed through recently renovated wings as if someone chose reusable spaces. One of the psychologists involved, Dr. Emery Halston, decided to cross-reference the data with old files, accessing penitentiary records between 1950 and 1990. He discovered something hidden beneath the official names, an internal cell marking code where the number 3B appeared repeatedly, but never in the same building. The cell was not a room. It was an activation point. Elijah knew. From the beginning, every sentence, every silence, every ambiguous answer, everything was part of a script built for someone at some point to figure it out. But the objective was not to reveal the crime. It was to guarantee continuity. In one of the last interviews, Elijah told the psychiatrist, "It's not about who disappeared. It's about who didn't come back. They only cross paths when someone allows them to." When asked what exactly he allowed, Elijah smiled and pointed to his chest. "The cell exists here too. You just don't realize it's locked." The case was officially closed. No one to blame, no body, no proof. But prison documents show that over the next 2 weeks, 3 other inmates from different wings were transferred for no reason, and a detail remains at the foot of the reports, marked. In pen, like an informal signature, he still needs 5. Because Thomas wasn't the end, he was the means. The message needed a container, and Elijah, from the beginning, just wanted someone to listen. Thomas Riggs was not declared dead. He was not sought. Even his absence did not generate an outcry. His name was quietly removed from federal records, and his cell number was assigned to another inmate weeks later, as if nothing had happened. But whoever slept there next did not survive more than 3 nights. Severe psychotic episode, according to the medical report. Involuntary commitment. No record since. Elijah is still alive, in total confinement. The padded cell has no cameras, no objects, and no pen or paper. Still, the patterns continue to appear. In the marks on the mattress, in the cracks in the walls, in the vapor of frozen breath. He doesn't need his hands to keep writing. He just needs the time. And time, as always, is on his side. In the last auditory recorded in the corridor outside the cell, captured by chance, a voice was heard during the early morning shift. It wasn't Elijah, not any guard. The voice said, 2 left, then he'll leave. Nobody knows who he is, not even where it would come from. But the files now indicate that the first disappearance under the same conditions occurred in 1943, in a decommissioned prison in New Jersey, which never had a record of cell 3B. It's as if the cell doesn't belong in the building. Not even time. She'd just wait. By the right name for the correct answer. Thomas said yes, and with that he opened the passage. Now it remains to be seen who will be the next to respond. Because Elijah is still there. And every morning at 3:16 a.m., he keeps saying, he's already crossed over. You just need to open your eyes. If you've listened this far, you may have already responded without realizing it. Leave a like. Comment below, "Silence never lies," and sign up, because in the next episode, you'll meet who confessed, but he was never arrested, because the only witness to the crime has disappeared along with the cell.